This topic we're discussing today is one that infuses a lot of our conversations at Trusting News, a lot of our conversations with journalists. And we've been running workshops around it for a couple of years now, but those workshops tend to be really in depth, and we're really looking for ways to make the material we're going to cover today more kind of bite-sized and accessible. So thank you for being here while we figure some things out. And I am excited to talk about how journalists talk about what they cover, how journalists talk to each other about what their communities need from their work, and how doing that in a more candid way, a more nuanced way, can actually strengthen our coverage. So some of you are new to Trusting News. Welcome. I'm Joy, the Executive Director. Since 2016, we have been learning as much as we can about how people decide what news to trust and equipping journalists to actively demonstrate credibility and earn trust. I've been in journalism for 25 years, been working in community engagement since 2010. And I was most recently teaching at the Missouri School of Journalism before starting Trusting News. I live in Sarasota, Florida, where the weather's beautiful this time of year. For this discussion today, I added another slide with some other dimensions of who I am as a human being, because that's what we're here to talk about. I have an 18 and 21-year-old who have vastly different ways of looking at the world and going through the world. I learn a lot from them. I have a husband who used to be a journalist and is now a social worker. I learn a lot from him and from what he faces day to day. I've lived in 8 states, but spread around the country, so I have a lot of different kind of geographic lenses on the world. I sing in the choir at my church, and I'm really active there. And I really have been committed the last several years to learning as much as I can about how different people see the world. I do that on some issues really, really successfully. And on others, I still really struggle to kind of empathize and fully understand different ways of seeing the world, but it's something I'm always working on. So at Trusting News, we talk a lot about transparency. That's kind of where our work began in 2016, is what do people not understand about journalism, and how do we as journalists get on the record about our ethics, our integrity, how we make decisions, things that give us our credibility. And then the work is also very much about engagement. What does it mean to listen really well, to think through, to be responsive to what we hear, and to think about what relationship we actually want with the people we aim to serve. And then increasingly, the more we do this work, the more it is about humility. Do we show up for conversations with a spirit of curiosity, acknowledging that we could do better as an industry and as a specific newsroom or community? And do we understand that we serve the public we have, not the public we wish we had? And so any conversations about our public service mission need to be honest about what slices of the public we are serving well and which we are not. We are very rooted in a couple of key questions. Who feels seen and understood by our journalism, and who feels neglected or misrepresented by our journalism? And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So answering those questions about who feels served and not served by our journalism, our newsroom culture and dynamics will play a big role in how successfully we can answer those questions and in what we're willing to hear. As a staff, are we rewarded for curiosity about that? Are we rewarded for challenging each other? Who feels comfortable to speak up in the newsroom and who does not? What kind of behavior and interactions with colleagues is rewarded and incentivized? How do we make decisions? What do we prioritize? So today we're going to share 5 tips for evolving newsroom cultures. And then we really would love to hear from you as well. We've got an interactive but anonymous exercise we'll go through together to hear about your own information needs and your community's information needs, and also the obstacles that you think get in the way in your newsrooms of better meeting those needs. So I want to pause for a second and say that further on, we're going to really explore 4 key questions we hope newsrooms will incorporate. But I wanted to give you a little preview of them early on in the talk here so that you could be thinking about them. Who might feel neglected by this story? Whose voices might the community notice are absent? What would it feel like in the newsroom to ask that question routinely? Who might feel misrepresented by this story? Whose realities might contradict the picture we're painting? Are we reflecting nuance and not lazy narratives or stereotypes? And will this story be hearable by a broad audience? Is there anything we can do to make that more possible? So those are questions that are kind of at the root of what we're talking about today. So a bit of background on this framework. A couple of years ago, we developed a project called Dimensions of Difference. You can find it at trustingnews.org/dimensions. It really looks at the relationship between us as individuals, our newsrooms, and the communities we aim to serve. And is a project that we have gone through with newsrooms in a variety of ways. It was co-developed with Eve Perlman at Spaceship Media, where they do a lot of really wonderful work on reducing polarization, restoring trust, and conversations across divides, both in newsrooms and also helping communities talk across divides. So Eve and I created this program together. There are 4 core ideas behind the Dimensions of Difference framework. The first is a basic acknowledgement that as journalists and human beings, we all come from somewhere, and who we are informs what we see. It informs what we find curious, what we find normal or abnormal, which informs what we notice, because you tend to notice things that you find abnormal. Where we come from informs what we're sympathetic to or skeptical of, who we tend to sort of sympathize with. That's true for cultural beliefs and processes. It's true for political beliefs. It's also true for really basic things like what is a normal amount of money for something to cost, for something like a house to cost, right? The answer is going to be really different depending on where you come from and where you live now. So that's all about our lens on the world. Second idea is that our own experiences, values, and views inform our journalism, and that recognizing it's important to see how those factors influence our journalism. So when you become aware that how you see the world is not universal, and there are other reasonable ways to see the world, that makes us more able to kind of separate our assumptions and identify them so that they're not accidentally showing up in our work, because we all have a way to talk about the world as if it's a universal experience. And so taking time to realize when, that wonderful experience we have as human beings where someone says, oh, I see that completely differently, or that wasn't true in my childhood at all, or that's not how my neighbors would see that at all. There's real value in that. We need to stay curious about that. So third core idea here is that talking about those differences helps us make more nuanced, accurate choices in our journalism. Our journalism is improved when we're able to talk to each other about that. We want our colleagues to be able to say, my family would see that differently. That would not have been true in my community. I see that, I come at that from a different point of view. I think you might be missing something big that the people in our community might be experiencing around this topic. The lens we bring to our work is something that we would like to see us address more specifically. Because at their best, newsroom teams contribute to each other's work. One of the features of journalism is that we hold each other accountable for fairness. It's not up to each of us individually to be the arbiter, the final say on whether a piece of journalism is accurate, nuanced, fair, and contextual. We rely on each other to make that better. So the more we as journalists see each other and share of ourselves, the more accurate all journalism will feel to our communities. Ideally, as human beings, we all would remain curious about these things. But as journalists, our responsibility to do so is outsized. The responsibility we have to document our communities and shape the narratives of our communities means we have an extra responsibility to stay curious about what we might be missing. So that is the philosophy behind the work. We know it works. Here's a quote from the executive editor of the Charlotte Observer. Charlotte is one of the newsrooms we have taken this work to in person, where we'll spend 2 or 3 days with the newsroom and work with a whole newsroom team. But as I said at the top, we're trying to take this work from something that requires a whole team to spend a few days with us to more bite-sized efforts. So that's what today's session is about. And we'll look forward to getting your feedback about that. So our goal is to be continually improving coverage so that more people feel seen and understood by it, and so that more people can hear it. More people are left without obstacles to accessing it because it seems irrelevant or like it comes from a lens that does not match their own. So let's get on with the tips. Tip number 1 is to identify staffed lived experiences, expertise, and perspectives. Newsrooms, it's interesting. I mean, this is not a controversial idea. Newsrooms would usually say that they value having people on their teams that have a diversity of lived experience, values, and views. And so the first question I often ask is, how much do you know about the values and views of your team, and how do you work together? The second question is, how comfortable are we bringing those things to work? What we're finding in our work with Newsrooms is that colleagues know each other a lot less well than they used to. They're spending less time in person. Interactions are more transactional, and we just are not kind of observing each other go through the world as much as we used to. We're not just chatting as much as we used to. We don't have as many serendipitous opportunities to offer up our own expertise and experience as we observe our colleagues do our work. So we're looking for ways to, in ways that feel welcoming and non-threatening and really authentic, invite people to bring more of themselves to their work. So part of our Dimensions of Difference workshop is an identity mapping exercise that you can do with your team. Obviously, people only have to share what they choose to share, but it is interesting to go through this exercise. And if Molly made it back on, she'll be sticking a link in the chat. If not, we'll be sure to share it back on after. We'll share the links with you afterwards in an email. But it's interesting to look through and say, here are things that feel core to my identity. Maybe it's my caregiving experience. Maybe it's my religion. Maybe it's the type of community I come from. Coming from a small town is really crucial to my identity. It's interesting to do this as a group and then have a conversation about where you sort of over-index and under-index. We know a lot of people in our community is serving as caregivers. Who on our team can relate to that experience? Remember that one of the questions we're asking is who on our team can relate to the needs and experiences of our community. So if there are people in your community who feel neglected or misrepresented, it might be because characteristics of their life are also underrepresented in the newsroom. So if you have trouble being relevant to or telling stories about rural communities, for example, and boy, do I have stories about how rural communities feel about how urban journalists tell the stories of their lives. Oh my gosh, you guys. So do you know who on your team is a good person to turn to ask questions about life in those communities? Whether they grew up there, live there now, have people there they could turn to run things by. What do you know about your colleagues' experience with things like the immigration system, with faith communities they represent, with political views? So we're talking about how all of this is in service of identifying the gaps that our team has on matters of identity and perspective, values and views that are represented in your community. So here's an example I really love. The Tangle newsletter is one that our team looks to a lot. It's grown a lot in recent years, and they have a goal. Isaac Saul, the founder, has a goal. Every day he shares a topic in the news and says, kind of, here's what the right is saying about this, here's what the left is saying about this, and here's what I think about this, aiming to share the best version of arguments and really help people understand each other. And he has this on his ethics page. He talked about hiring an intern who was pro-life and how when she became the single most important person on his team anytime they covered abortion, he sought out opinions and asked her to point out what they might be getting wrong. I think about that a lot because I wonder how many people covering abortion in the country have deep empathy for understanding of pro-life views. I know that you certainly cannot go ask your colleagues their stance on abortion, and I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that you have the kind of culture. Wouldn't it be great if we had the kind of culture where somebody would be rewarded for or appreciated for being willing to say, actually, I come from a family that has strong pro-life views, and here's what I think we might be missing about this. Here's why I think that language is limiting. Here are some stories, some things I hear them talking about that I haven't seen us cover. So not suggesting for a second that we need to go interrogate our colleagues about how they feel about sensitive issues, just that, or about their backgrounds, certainly. But you can build an environment that will help people feel comfortable. I have had really transformative things come up in conversations with newsrooms where people felt really comfortable sharing about their family's history with the criminal justice system or with addiction, their own personal physical and mental health challenges. Many things have come up that once the offer was made, once the intention was there, that sharing about our lives could be helpful, people felt invited to and therefore comfortable to. But we do have to be really careful, obviously, about putting people on the spot or helping them or making them feel like the expectation is that they should share. So tip number 2 is let's talk about what it looks like to value the contributions of people who speak up and frankly, make sure they aren't punished for it, make sure that goes well. This takes some really deft moderation and leadership, I think. One thing that we have found works really, really well is to keep the focus on the work, to keep the focus on the journalism. The reason we are talking about how people across the community feel about abortion and how we feel about abortion, it might be a tough, I might have to, that's an extra tough topic. So we'll see how I feel as I get through this about using that as an example. But the reason we're doing that is so that our coverage can be more reflective of and feel accurate to and reflect the diversity of views across the community. So we're not there to talk about it. We're not there to debate amongst each other. We're there to help make the journalism better. So when topics like this come up, when you realize that people in the newsroom feel differently about something, or when people want to weigh in on each other's coverage, invited or uninvited, it's really important not to try to prove each other wrong, not to debate. It's important to give people the benefit of the doubt in terms of we all want the work to be as good as possible. We are here because we all believe in doing good journalism and in community service. It's important to speak not in generalities, but to point to specific things like, here's a word that you use and I wonder if you realize how that might come across to some people, or here's an assumption I think is kind of baked into that story. And I wonder if we could talk about, who might have felt left out of that story or who might see that just completely differently. And stay really curious about each other and remember that all of us as individuals do not have the full picture. If you are a boss trying to make these things happen, you got a big job to do. I would say start by modeling what it looks like, sharing pieces of your own life and sharing your own perspective. That can be tricky because you probably already take up a lot of oxygen in the room, and it's really important to make sure that other people also people with less power and agency also feel comfortable talking. But I think being willing to be a little vulnerable about it yourself is important. Be really aware of how you respond when other people speak up. If people feel dismissed or worse, ridiculed or criticized, they're certainly never going to do it again. And people speaking up and challenging you is when it's most important to be careful about how you respond yourself. I think paying attention to who feels comfortable speaking and who does not is so important. What we hear of way too often at Trusting News is that management feels comfortable speaking up. Younger journalists and often young women journalists, often young journalists of color just feel less free to speak their mind and challenge. People feel like they are brought into newsrooms because of some of their, some things about them that they could be contributing. But once they get there, it's too dangerous to actually contribute and shake things up and challenge the way, the assumptions that are built into the newsroom. So it's just so important to only encourage people to speak up if you're really going to pay attention to who and make sure that that invitation feels authentic across the board. If you notice that people aren't feeling comfortable speaking up, if you have a good relationship with them, it is okay to privately ask them for their views or ask them if they feel comfortable, but certainly don't put them on the spot. And definitely watch out for other managers who might be undercutting or undermining the efforts through the way that they are interacting with staffers. If you're not a boss, it's completely normal to be suspicious about this, to worry about what might happen if you speak up, to worry about repercussions with colleagues, to feel like maybe you're not part of the club or not a member of the team or not being supportive if you rock the boat. Perfectly appropriate to store up your social capital and speak up only when it matters to you. Also perfectly valid not to speak up if you don't feel comfortable. But if you do, I would say at times where it really matters, find the allies, find colleagues and managers who you think would be open to it, and kind of dip your toe in that way. It's certainly not the type of thing that you want to just unleash across the whole newsroom. So let me share just one quick idea. We wrote a bit ago about a Slack channel at the Philadelphia Inquirer called Content Consult. And what this is a Slack channel visible to the whole company, not just the newsroom, where people can ask for sort of sensitivity readers on their stories. The idea is any pushback you might get after publication, see if you can invite input before publication instead. And so sometimes that might be, I'm writing about a really sensitive issue. Does anybody who has experience with this willing to read behind me? You might ask specific questions about language or sourcing. They say that the topics that come up in the Slack channel cover a really broad range of topics. There's a volunteer group of moderators that can help. You can kind of raise your hand and say, hey, if this comes up, I'm happy to talk about it either publicly or privately. You don't have to take the advice your colleagues give, but it is kind of a pipeline for, I wonder if we have somebody who has a lived experience with this that would be useful. Sometimes conversations do move private and you can post anonymously, but over time, people have gotten a lot more comfortable with it. So that's just an example of how to sort of build into the routines, the expectation that you will weigh in on each other's work. So speaking of routines, tip number 3 is let's talk about the routines of our work and how we talk about our work, where we gather to talk about our work. So I think about morning meetings. I think about story pitches. If these things are happening on Slack, it might be that the questions we're going to propose show up best there. But what we're really talking about is those questions I posted at the top. Imagine if, as you said, hey, here's a story I'm working on today. Or as an editor was reporting about how a story was going to the rest of the leadership team or to the rest of the newsroom, what would it feel like if by design, whoever's running the meeting says, or the editor talking about the story says, okay, is this story going to be hearable by a broad audience? Who do we hope will hear this story? And if it's, a huge swath of the community, what might get in the way of that? Is there anything we could do? Are there any lazy stereotypes we might be reinforcing here? Who might feel misrepresented by this story? As what we're wondering is what it would feel like to make these questions part of your habit. Maybe in each morning meeting, you look for a story to ask them about, or a couple times a week. Imagine how much better your coverage could be if your team felt comfortable challenging each other's work. Ideally, you wouldn't need to pause and ask the questions. People would just feel comfortable. But I think especially as you're getting ready to launch this as an idea, then having some structure around it could be really useful. In smaller team meetings or one-on-one conversations, people might feel more free to do it. If just with a small team that you work really closely with, it can get tricky. The power dynamics and group dynamics are so tricky. So you just have to really pay attention to how managers will handle anything that comes up. But if you're not sure how this could work in your newsroom, I wonder about suggesting it to a small group of people who work really well together and seem especially open to collaboration and feedback and are curious about how well their coverage is serving their community. Think about where in your newsroom you could try these things out. Tip number 4 is invite individuals to consult on stories, but only if they want to. And I want to just really, really reiterate that a real danger of this work is that people could feel put on the spot or tokenized or required to make themselves vulnerable in service of the coverage. And that's just not what we have in mind at all. So we all know that certain people in the newsroom are often asked to speak on behalf of an entire community in ways that are exhausting and inappropriate. It's not okay to assume that people are comfortable with that. It's also not okay when you know something about people that maybe not everybody knows to call them out or assume that they would like to share their perspective with the group. So it's best to ask one-on-one if they're comfortable weighing in those situations. Okay, so I have a few things to share just with additional resources and background, and then I am going to, I'd love to hear from you guys about how you think these things might work and what might get in the way. So a few additional resources that can offer background about how we think about these things. Our dimensions of difference work actually began with a hiring guide for editors. It is questions that people hiring in newsrooms could ask job candidates to get a sense of what they might contribute to the newsroom. It includes questions like, what worldviews, values, or experiences do you understand well? And which are you most curious about, or do you wish you understood more deeply? You could ask questions like, we know newsrooms tend to be made up of people who come from similar backgrounds and experiences. Do you have any thoughts to share about what you could bring that might help us diversify, or about how newsrooms in general can do a better job representing their communities? You obviously need to be really careful with what you can ask and not ask, but we worked with some partner journalists and also some of their HR departments to put together questions that kind of model the spirit of the type of newsroom culture we're trying to build, and also invite people to share what about themselves might be helpful to your newsroom. We also have an anti-polarization checklist that some of you guys have heard us talk about before. That's just questions to pause on as you're reporting and editing, to help you examine your headline framing, your story framing, the language you're using, that sort of thing. We have a weekly newsletter, Trust Tips, that we send out each Tuesday afternoon with one actionable way that newsrooms could be earning trust. And we're mostly sharing updates about our work on LinkedIn and Blue Sky these days, so do look for us there. We have a whole series of trust kits that walk through some foundational strategies for earning trust. Today, I was taking a look again at the trust kit on funding and ownership, because of the news of how Jeff Bezos' decisions about how the opinion section at the Post will be focused. And we also have a trust kit on opinion coverage and making sure that we're clear why we include opinions in our coverage and that sort of thing. But we have trust kits on transparency, on making our ethics visible, on earning trust with sources, all kinds of things.